Hey, it's Art from My New Microphone. In this video, I'd like to discuss mid-side processing and how it can help you in your stereo mixes. First off, the term mid-side is a bit of a misnomer. A more technically accurate term would be sum difference, because in mid-side, we are taking effectively the sum of the left and right channels and turning it into a mid channel. And we are taking likewise the difference between the left and right stereo channels and turning those into a side channel. So once stereo audio is passed through a mid-side matrix, the sum of the left and right channels become the mid channel. This would be the same as if we were to sum the mix to mono, and the differences between the left and right stereo channels becomes the side channel. Before moving on, I would also like to discuss quickly the mid-side microphone technique, where we would have a unidirectional microphone, often a cardioid, pointing at the source, and then we would also have a coincident figure 8 microphone that would point to either side. We use these two microphones to capture a source when recording, and then once we get into the mixing session, we will take the unidirectional microphone's channel and pan it to the center. Then we will take the bidirectional or figure 8 microphone, duplicate the channel, pan one copy hard left and the other copy hard right, and then flip the polarity of one of those copies. The result will be similar to that of mid-side processing, where we will have a strong mid channel provided by the unidirectional microphone, and also a very wide side channel provided by the two out-of-phase copies of the bidirectional microphone signal. Summing these three microphone channels together in mono will effectively cancel out the side information, as they are completely out of phase with one another. Again, they are exact copies with opposite polarity. This is similar to the mid channel that would be produced by a mid-side matrix, as we are effectively summing together the left and right channels. So, getting back to the mix, again, the mid channel will effectively be the sum of the left and right stereo channels, and the side information will be made up of panned elements and stereo effects with an effective hole in the middle of the image. The dry center panned mono tracks in the mix will disappear in the side information. However, any stereo effects that are affecting those tracks may be present in the side's information. As we're processing in mid-side, any processing we apply to the side channel will disappear as the mix is summed to mono for mono playback. This is important to note because we may want more or fewer differences in the balance of our mix when switching between mono playback and stereo playback. Let's now hop into our digital audio workstation, and I'll give you a better auditory idea of how mid-side processing works. So to give legitimacy to the term mid-side, we can use mid-side processing to easily alter the balance between the mids and the side information within our mix. When the mid and side channels are equally balanced, we effectively have the same mix as we had in stereo with our left and right channels. However, altering the balance between these mid and side channels is a very easy way to either widen a mix or make a mix more narrow. As we learn more about mid-side processing in this video, try to envision it all as width modulation. That is affecting the overall width of the mix with mid-side processing, even though we will be looking at more standard processes like EQ and compression. To really understand mid-side processing, we should look at it through the lens of width modulation. So you may have gathered this already, but the main benefit of using mid-side processing is the independent control it gives us over the mid and side information of the mix. This is especially important on stereo buses, and even finds special use on the mix bus and in mastering. I should make it clear that mid-side processing is not possible on mono tracks, even if those mono tracks are panned around the stereo spectrum. However, if these mono panned tracks are sent to a stereo bus or the mix bus, we can certainly utilize mid-side processing to have independent control over the mids and the sides, otherwise known as the sum and the difference of the left and right channels of that stereo bus or mix bus. We can use any process or plugin when dealing with mid-side processing. However, the most common processor used in mid-side processing seems to be EQ. With mid-side EQ, we can brighten or darken or affect the frequency masking of the sides and the mids independent of each other. Side EQ is great for adjusting the ambience of a mix through effects like reverb and delay, and it's also great for adjusting the hard panned doubled tracks like background vocals or doubled guitars. We can also engage a high pass filter on the side EQ to get rid of any stereo information in the very low end to help clean up and make a more powerful and punchy low end if we haven't done so on the individual tracks and buses already. Likewise, we can use mid EQ to adjust the balance of likely the most important tracks of the mix, which are often panned to the center, without affecting the overall balance of the ambience and other tracks that are panned hard left and hard right. As for compression, we can apply it to the side information to bring up the width and ambience of the mix without affecting the overall dynamics of the backbeat, vocal, bass guitar, and other important elements that are panned directly to the center of the mix. By compressing the mid channel, we can effectively glue together the important center elements of the stereo image without affecting the flow of the ambience or the hard panned instruments in the mix. Mid-side EQ and compression are great tools to improve the mix. However, when using mid-side processing, we need to remember that the key here is subtlety and to not go overboard with our processing. As another example, we can insert a saturation plugin or processor on the side information to give more harmonic excitement to the width, ambience, and hard panned instruments of the mix. Note that this harmonic saturation will disappear as the mix is summed back to mono for mono playback. The big benefit here being that we can add harmonic excitement to the stereo mix without affecting the mono compatibility. If you're finding this video informational thus far, I would invite you to hit that like button and to also check out the description box down below, either now or after the video, and click on my mixing cheat sheet. This is a reference guide I put together to help you make the right decisions at the right times in your mixes. Of course, there are no cheat codes when it comes to mixing, but I put together this cheat sheet to help you make those right decisions and get better mixes in your sessions. So again, I will leave a link in the description box for my free mixing cheat sheet for you to check out if you are interested. Thanks. All right, so here we are inside of Logic Pro, and let's have a look at mid-side processing, and we will start by simply monitoring in mono versus monitoring in the sides. So what I have here is a little bit of a convoluted approach to doing this. If you have a very easy plugin for mid-side processing, use that and let me know what it is in the comments down below. But for this example, we'll just quickly be using the channel EQ. And we have right here in Logic, you can set up either stereo processing or mid-side processing. And so what we have here is on the mids, I just cranked down the gain here. And I also have a low pass filter all the way down at 220 Hertz and a high pass filter all the way up at 20,000 Hertz. So absolutely everything is cut from the signal here. And I've done the same thing to the sides. So when the EQ is engaged on the mids, it means that there are no mids. And when the EQ is engaged on the sides, it will mean that there are no sides. So looking at this right here, we will have, when I engage the mids, there will only be side information. And when I engage the sides EQ, there will only be mid information. If I engage both of them and we listen back, there will be nothing. And if I disengage both of them, then we have the full stereo spectrum. And so I will use a multimeter right here to analyze the left, mid, and right channels here. And so we will listen back in, let's start with mono. So I will mute the sides information. So you see here that it's only in the mids. Now if I go to the full stereo range, you see that there's a lot of information in the stereo image as well. And then if I mute the mids, then we only have the side information. And so what I'm trying to show here is just the difference in monitoring between the mids only versus the sides only versus the entire stereo mix. And so let's toggle through those a few more times just to really get a sense of what the mids and the sides are. Just the sides. Entire stereo mix. And just the mids. And so by muting the sides, we effectively are summing the mix to mono, and we can have a look here on our gain plugin. We'll actually sum this mix bus to mono, and then we will toggle that off. We will mute the sides information with this EQ right here, and let's toggle back and forth and hear the differences between these two. They should sound the exact same. So again, by muting the sides information, we are left with effectively a summed to mono mix at the mix bus here. Okay, so that's how it goes when we are muting the sides versus the mids information. Now let's look at if we are to boost the sides versus the mids, or to cut the sides versus the mids. And to do that, we will also use an EQ. I will actually go ahead and copy down this channel EQ. We will mute this first one, open the second one, and we'll get rid of these moves on the mids and the sides. And what I'll be doing here is I will play the mix back and I will boost the sides information relative to the mids, and I will cut the sides information relative to the mids. And what we should hear is, as I boost the sides information, we should hear the mix getting wider as we're increasing the amount of information in the sides. And as I cut the sides information like this, we should hear the mix getting narrower. Again, if I brought this all the way down to negative infinity, we would effectively have a summed to mono mix with no side information whatsoever. So I will play this back and I'll try to make it very obvious. These are not moves that I would necessarily do in a mix to go this extreme, but rather it's just to give a very clear example of how boosting the sides information or cutting the sides information will affect the width of the mix. So here we go. So in addition to it getting a lot louder as I was boosting the sides and getting quite quieter when I was cutting the sides, you also heard that difference in width. Now, a boost of wherever we were at plus 13 dB is pretty extreme, as is a cut of the full negative 24 available on this EQ plugin. But again, I'm just trying to show you that boosting the sides information or cutting the sides information will affect the overall width of the mix. So you can use that in your mixes to, again, improve the width or decrease the width. So before we get out of this EQ plugin, let's look at how mid-side EQ can be used to affect the overall width of the mix at certain frequencies. So rather than affecting the entire band right here, let's actually go in and have a look at certain frequency bands, particularly in the sides information right here. So for example, we can come here and try a boost at around 1000 Hertz and see what that sounds like in the mix. And what I'll do is I'll bring this down and I'll cut and boost just this frequency right here. So you hear that same widening and narrowing effect. However, it's kind of centered around this 1000 Hertz range right here. So we can use EQ in a specific way to affect the width of certain frequency bands within the mix. As a side note, I wouldn't recommend making the low end wider than it needs to be. Low end information is almost always better when it is mono. And widening the low end energy can lead to issues in phase and muddiness when monitoring back in both stereo and in mono systems. So again, with mid-side EQ, we can opt to increase or decrease certain ranges in the sides to either widen or narrow the stereo image. And we can also go about and affect the mid-range frequencies here as we see fit. For example, if we had some mid-range buildup in the center image of the mix, we could go ahead and cut that and maybe boost a frequency in the upper mid-range to help bring out the presence of the center image of the mix. So I will go ahead and play back this track and make movements in this mid-side EQ to give you a sense of how mid-side EQ can either benefit or detract from the mix. So here we go. I'll A/B test this EQ. So these are pretty subtle moves. Again, I brought down the gain right here to kind of level match, so with that when we are A-Bing, we don't have that loudness bias. But I think that these moves right here help to bring out the width a little bit and also help to reduce a little bit of that low-end muddiness around the 200 hertz range here in the mids particularly. And so it sounds a little bit wide without being too wide. It's very easy when applying mid-side EQ to sometimes go overboard when pushing the sides information to increase the width of the mix. Wider often sounds better, especially when monitoring in headphones, but can quickly fall apart when pushed too far. So it's important to be aware of this and to be careful when pushing the sides information too far in mid-side EQ. So that wraps up the brief explanation on EQ. Let's quickly move on now to compression. And I will bring up this compressor here. I also have this set up to mid-side here in Logic Pro. And we can go ahead and compress the mids independently from the sides. So let's listen through and make some adjustments here with the compressor. So again, we are processing the mix bus, so I don't want to over compress and really squash the dynamics of the entire mix. However, a little bit of compression here in the mids helps to solidify the center image, and I'm leaving here on the sides the full dynamics of the original signal. You could hear, however, when I brought the threshold down and we were hitting around -5 dB of gain reduction, that the overall width of the mix was kind of narrowing. Again, because the sides information was being brought down in overall level here. But let's quickly listen back to subtle amounts of compression on the mids and no compression whatsoever on the sides and how that sounds in the mix. Bringing down that gain for better A-Bing. So that to me really helps bring out the percussion, particularly the kick and the snare, which are centered in the mix. There's a whole lot more we can do with mid-side compression. We could really squash the sides relative to the mids if that's what the mix needed. However, in this brief tutorial, I just wanted to go through how I would opt to use mid-side compression in the context of this mix, where I would leave the sides much alone and I would go into the mids and just compress it slightly to bring out, again, those percussive elements and the overall glue of the center image. All right, and the last mid-side processor I have for you today is saturation. And what we will be using for this example is the FabFilter Saturn II. This is not a stock Logic plugin. This is a third-party plugin. I will leave a link in the description box down below if you'd like to check out Saturn II for yourself. But what we'll be doing in this is we still have mid-side processing set up here. We will go to the side and apply a little bit of saturation to really bring out and excite the harmonics of the sides information relative to the mids, which can help again to excite the sides information and excite the width of a mix while still maintaining great mono compatibility in the mix here. So in the mids, I'm not going to apply any saturation, and in the sides, we will play back and I'll just adjust this drive to give more or less saturation and try to find a sweet spot in the mix. So let's start with out, and here we go. So even just a 34.55% drive on this saturation plugin just on the sides can really help bring out that side information and that harmonic excitement right here. But before we hop out of Logic Pro, I just want to show you how when we are monitoring in mono or summed to mono, any sides processing will effectively cancel out because, again, when we are summing to mono, we are getting rid of any side information in the mix. So we are monitoring the mix in mono, and what I'm going to do is go through these compression, EQ, and saturation settings and really drive up the sides information. And you'll notice that none of the effects that I do on the sides will actually be heard when summing to mono. So just to prove this, let's play this back. And now if I was to open this back up to stereo, it would likely sound pretty bad. Let's actually turn this down a little bit because we have a big gain boost right here. But when it's summed to mono, again, any sides processing will disappear. So that's what I've got for you in this video inside Logic Pro. Moving on, I would like to address a concern with mid-side processing that has to do specifically with side EQ. You may know that an inherent side effect of EQ is frequency-dependent phase shift. So wherever the EQ is boosting or cutting frequencies, there will be phase shifts at those frequencies. I actually have a detailed video on this subject. I'll leave a card to it up here and a link in the description box down below. But when EQing side information with a mid-side EQ, these phase shifts can actually move the track or bus around the stereo spectrum. Sometimes these directional shifts are audible and other times they aren't. Again, subtlety is key when using mid-side processing. But to avoid this altogether, I would highly recommend using a linear phase EQ with a mid-side option, especially if you will be using more aggressive EQ cuts and boosts. Linear phase EQs are designed specifically to not produce any phase shifts along the frequency spectrum. Another concern worth addressing is that when processing in mid-side, it's often best to use a proper set of studio headphones. That way we can really hear what's going on in the mix. The inherent acoustic crossfeed between a left and right studio monitor can really blur our perception of what's happening in the mid and side channels and how it relates to the greater stereo image of the mix. And the third concern is to A/B test for mono compatibility quite regularly as we are working through our mid-side processing. This can be done by summing the entire mix bus to mono periodically to hear how the entire mix will translate to mono playback. Or if we are using mid-side processing on the mix bus, we can simply mute the side information and have a listen to what it will sound in mono. Monitoring in mono at the beginning of the mix and then periodically throughout the mix is an important habit to develop as we go through mixing our sessions. I actually have a dedicated video on this topic. I'll leave a card above right here and a link to the video in the description box down below. So I encourage and challenge you to use mid-side processing in at least some capacity in your next mix, and let me know how it goes in the comment section down below. Be sure to give this video a like and to check out the free My New Microphone mixing cheat sheet in the description box down below. If you'd like to hang out with me a little more on YouTube, I'll put another few videos up here having to do with mixing that I think will be worthwhile checking out. So click on one of these, and I will see you in the next video.